Hello, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Key Components for Applying Safety Risk to EHS, Defining and Building a Risk Management Strategy for Environmental, Health, and Safety Management Systems, sponsored by ETQ. My name is Kyle Morrison. I'm the Senior Associate Editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you all for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. The views of the speaker and his organization are his own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorse them. At the end of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. Feel free to ask your question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but due to the large number of participants today, we may not get to all the questions. However, any unanswered question will be forwarded on to today's speaker. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the presentation. The webcast will be archived for 3 months, so you can access it after today's live presentation. Within about a day, just simply return to the same URL to access the webcast. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to begin. Our speaker today is Glenn Fraser. Glenn has been involved in the IT industry for more than 10 years and currently provides EHS pre-sale support and training for ETQ. He also participates in ETQ's Product Improvement Committee. Glenn?
Thank you, and welcome everyone. So to get started, what I'd like to do is just briefly describe our agenda to you. So a number of objectives. We'd like to talk about different ways that you can measure compliance in today's complex world, how risk management processes are driving some new ways of thinking and looking at compliance efforts, to help you try and understand the relationship between risk assessment and actual risk management, and then to look into some of the different ways that different industries evaluate risk, all right, and help to quantify that. Very, very briefly, a little bit about ETQ, our company. We are a leading provider of compliance software, and we help organizations with all aspects of their compliance efforts, whether that is environmental, health, safety, quality, or even that which is regulated by an external entity. The company, ETQ, has been around for more than 20 years. Our founders actually have a tremendous background. They were lead assessors or auditors, really understand the business and the pains that our customers go through. We developed a flexible workflow engine to help automate business processes, and again, no matter what sort of compliance effort that is. Now, next slide. Our software itself helps manage all parts of your compliance efforts. It's very configurable, meaning that it may be modified without requiring a programmer. It is entirely web-based. There's nothing else to install. It comes pre-configured with best practices, very easy to use, and is designed to integrate with the software that you already own. Everything is available for reporting. It is software that you will never outgrow, and we offer a number of different ways and applications, modules, some might call them, to help you measure the risks that your organization would be facing. So I don't believe I need to tell anyone. The world is changing. We are just seeing an incredible rate of change with virtually everything. New regulations every day. They affect people. They affect our interaction with the environment, with our workers, with our product, with our processes that we've got. And of course, all of these are interrelated. You really cannot isolate any one of those and evaluate it on its own. So not only are things changing very quickly, but they're also much more complex than they used to be. The organizations themselves are getting more complex. We see lots of global organizations, companies, small, medium, large. They grow by acquisition or are acquired. They might be merging. This growth, no matter how it comes about, brings challenges. There are cultural differences. There are regional differences. There are corporate differences, social differences. We've got increased complexity in our systems, and much more increased scrutiny. There are many more regulations to comply with, and again, they are national, regional, local, and they can vary tremendously depending on where you are doing business. There is much less visibility. And our competitive landscape is changing as well. Customer tastes change, technology changes, there are global differences. We have to be compliant with environmental laws from all over, safety laws that vary, and we still need to compete with all of the other organizations that are out there. And all of this is happening while we need to be doing our ongoing business. So incredibly complex, incredible rate of change. All of this simply means that it is much more difficult to remain compliant. Compliance is very difficult to keep up with. Your organization has to do a couple of things. In our opinion, you have to use technology to its advantage. There's just so much to keep track of. It is so complex. It is so interrelated. It becomes virtually impossible to do this manually. So you have to take advantage of technology. Better use of automation to help you streamline your compliance processes is a necessity. You need to have these technologies integrated. They have to be able to communicate with each other. They have to provide visibility. And I'll talk very briefly about the idea of harmonization. And all I mean by that is, I'm going to expand on a concept I mentioned earlier, all of these things are interrelated. So very often we're seeing leading companies that are attempting to merge some of their quality, some of their environmental, some of their safety functions. And they're using a new measure that we're talking about today and simply seeing this as all part of the same process. You cannot isolate some of these things. Unfortunately, organizers have to recognize that this is costly. It does not come cheaply. However, we still believe that technology is your best alternative. Now, as I briefly alluded to, it may be time for companies to reevaluate how they're measuring what they deem to be compliant. We might need a new objective, a more efficient measure. In the past, we really relied on the sort of audit concept. We would go and we'd audit, are we compliant or are we not? It would be a pass or a fail, a 0, 100, and we'd have actions to address that. We're suggesting that that may be dated, and it may be time to be moving away from this idea of audit results to instead a risk measure. We maintain that risk is a much more effective measure of all of your compliance efforts. And again, I'm lumping together many different items under the general term of compliance. The standards themselves are catching on. So we're starting to see some changes in the way these are worded. You can benchmark the compliance thinking, if you will, by looking at the various standards that are out there. This is not an all-inclusive list, but it makes a very good starting point for discussion. All of these standards are increasingly referring to the concept of risk management. There is an element of risk guidance built into each and every one of these. And again, some are specific to environmental and safety, some are general quality, one is security. There's a number of different ones represented there, but that actually fits my point. These are all related. So with this new era of complexity and a strong focus on compliance, standards are starting to respond to the story of risk management. Risk is really the focal point of all of these compliance efforts. So there's a tremendous amount of consolidation here. And in fact, in the upcoming changes to the general ISO guideline, there is going to be a more than ever a section on risk management principles. So that will be interesting to follow. Now, I'd briefly like to talk about ISO 31000 for just a moment. This is non-industry specific. It is not an operational guide. It's a broad standard. It again is not for operation, but is rather for interpretation of how the risk management process really gets defined. And here I'm talking about the whole risk management versus a much smaller piece, which would usually be referred to as the risk analysis. Risk analysis is made up of two parts, and it's a key to risk management. But in risk analysis, you have to identify all of the risks that you're facing. And again, I would say that this goes across all operations. You need to understand where your processes might be affecting your people, safety, and where you might be interacting with the environment. So you have to look at all of the operations as a big picture. You also very much need to use a team to evaluate these. The idea of effective risk measure and management really is a team effort. You need multiple perspectives. Once you've identified all of these risks through a group think, a team meeting, however you choose to do that, you then need to start quantifying the risks and evaluating them. What you need is an agreement on the tools and what the different risk terms actually mean. You want to have the same meaning of high risk on a manufacturing floor to an environmental engineer to a safety person as you have to a manufacturing person and all the way up through your executive. You need people to have standard wording for your risk terms. We'll talk about some tools that you might consider very shortly. And of course, the most common and a really good one is the idea of using severity and probability of occurrence. They're great to start with. Risk needs to be an ongoing process. So we need to continuously be evaluating what are we going to do with this risk? What is it? What can we do about it? Make a decision from the appropriate level of risk. And then you need to implement that decision. There may be changes to your processes, to your operations. You might need to implement new controls to either mitigate or reduce the risk. And you can launch continuous improvement activities. Now that is going to bring us all the way back up to the top. You've now put controls, you've put changes in place. You've altered the risk landscape. You need to measure it again and go through the whole process. So it is a cycle that has to be gone through continuously. There are a number of evaluations that you can do with your risks. Sometimes we have to just accept it. Sometimes we can reduce it. Sometimes we can move that risk by either working with a partner, supply chain, or looking for someone else to pick it up, an insurer. And sometimes we decide that we simply can't accept the risk and need to stop. But these are all the sort of things that will come out as you evaluate each risk that you've identified. Now, a small graphic, courtesy of Wikipedia, just to get some terminology in place. A hazard, some sort of situation that poses a level of threat. Very often, this is the reason your organization exists. For many of us, it's why we're in business. Think of an oil company, if you would. Potentially, very hazardous. Airlines, same thing. Food companies face some serious hazards. A risk is actually the potential to release the hazard. Controls are things that we can put in place. Many people will call them barriers, actions to reduce the likelihood of an undesired event, the hazard coming to fruition, if you will. Many people ask if you can control everything. The answer, of course, is no, probably not. You have to evaluate the potential and react accordingly. And again, there's a number of things that you can do, from avoiding to accepting to transferring, that were mentioned on that previous slide. Risk is in everything that we do. And I'd also argue that there's tremendous risks in not doing something. I get to speak to a lot of different people in a lot of different industries. Every once in a while you find someone who believes they can avoid risk by simply doing nothing. And I would argue that that's not true. There is risk in everything we do. There is risk in everything that we don't do. Risk management covers a wide range of functions within our organizations. It is not about any one area. It is pervasive through everything. It spans your entire corporation, and in fact, many of the entities that you would interact with. As the graphic is attempting to illustrate, it's an umbrella that spans your whole enterprise. This does make it a very powerful concept. You can use risk as a universal methodology for benchmarking compliance within the organization. And each of these small sub-items is going to have different compliance efforts and guidelines, but once again, the level of risk brings a universal language to all of this. Now, this is not to say that risk management is easy. There are many challenges, and I'll describe a few of them for you. There is a lot of focus on the process of risk management. When people think about risk management, they often just think about the tools that they'll use to measure risk. Risk assessment is a tool, and it's going to help you to identify and measure risks, but it doesn't help you figure out the context to adjust your processes or deal with the risks. That's really more of the management perspective. What you don't want to do is just focus on the process of measuring risks. You need lots of data, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but content is critical. The more data you have, the easier it is to find unidentified hazards, to accurately identify, and to validate the risk levels that you're actually seeing. We'll talk about a number of different tools towards the end. Many of them are non-traditional thinking for environmental health and safety. Too often these risk tools get slotted. And if nothing else, I'd like you to think about some of the ways that a tool might be used outside of its traditional use. Next one. Understand the limitations of your process. Inherently, people are not good at assessing risks. And in fact, we're really bad at it. We don't expect the unexpected. It's hindsight. We, in reality, reconstruct events to fit what we believe we saw. Our minds demand order. We impose patterns on random events. In fact, we have a really hard time. We struggle with the concept of random. One of my favorite examples came out of a book I'll mention shortly, was the idea of the Apple Shuffle. I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea of iTunes and that you can shuffle tunes. When Apple first introduced that feature, it truly was random. And what that really meant was it would occasionally play two songs from the same artist, perhaps two very related. In fact, it could play the same song twice in a row. That's truly random. But people couldn't accept that. So Apple had to really redo that and make it a non-random function that people took to mean random. It didn't repeat two songs from the same artist. If you were shuffling your whole library, there was no chance it was going to repeat the song twice. It really made a pattern out of this that people think of as random. So to me, it was fascinating. We also think we have a really deep knowledge of all of our processes when we really don't. In reality, we usually only have a basic understanding, and we insert this understanding into a process and come to a very subjective conclusion. Our thinking, and I do mean every one of us, our human thinking process is flawed, and we aren't even able to recognize it. There are a number of things called cognitive biases, and again, they're covered in the reading that I'll describe in a moment, but they are truly fascinating. Prediction is practically impossible, and we need to look no further than expert opinion. What we really need is a lot of data, making sure that we're not dealing with small sample sets and single occurrences. We have to make sure that we have evidence and are not inferring, are not drawing conclusions, not seeing patterns that aren't really there. Next one is to use a structured approach, risk models. And I'll talk more about these in a moment. There's a number of different ways that you can attempt to model the risks that you're facing. And some of them work better than others, but once again, I'd encourage you to evaluate all of the tools at your disposal. Next slide says collect lots of data, and I've already mentioned this one. You need to roll out these risk models everywhere, get everyone thinking about risks. And once again, if everyone's using the same terms, that becomes very valuable through your whole organization across all parts of it. You need to not only monitor the things that have truly gone wrong, but also to monitor near misses. They're often just as telling, if not more educational, than an actual occurrence. So those need to be monitored very closely. And in fact, if you can capture them, track them, and trend on them, you're starting the journey towards predictive risk, and that has incredible value. Next, the reading that I promised. Actually, that's just an expansion of those earlier bullets. I'll just go to the next slide, which is the reading. These were fascinating to me. The first one, and I'll admit was the last one I read, was something called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Actually won a Nobel Prize with his research partner at the time. Fascinating book. Two others by Mr. Daniel Gardner, who is a reporter in the capital of Canada, Ottawa. He has a book called Future Babble. And this one talks about why we just can't believe what experts tell us, but again, our flawed human thinking wants us to. So why we believe them anyway. The other one by him was the one I personally found even more interesting, and that was called Risk, the Science and Politics of Fear. And it talks a lot about risk and the psychology of risk and makes a lot of references back to the Thinking Fast and Slow, the first one I mentioned. So that's actually why I put that one first in the list. All right. Those were fascinating, and there are plenty of others on the topic. Please don't get me wrong, but those are my three favorites. So back to the idea of measuring and assessing risks. Risk assessment is really the core methodology. So I've already mentioned you need to get a group together. You need to brainstorm all of the risks that you might be facing. This is what we're going to use to measure the risk levels. You need to evaluate the risk in context. So in its operational context, you have to try and describe and measure the risks that you're presented with. We need to make sure that we can replace a gut feel, a feeling, with an objective measure. This cannot be subjective. And we have to make sure that, again, the terms are universally understood throughout our organization. Assigning a level is easy to understand. From the floor of manufacturing all the way up through the executive, as long as we've got constant definitions, risk level is very easy to understand, even if we don't know the process. We can tell where the risks are, and we can get somebody who does know the process working appropriately. So you need to use your risk level to determine your actions. There's a lot of talk in specific industries around risk-based CAPA. This is the concept. You use risk levels to guide your actions, be they corrective, preventive. We need to beware a false sense of security. Risk levels have to be universal. I've mentioned that a number of times. But again, you have to recognize those limits and continually test them. This needs to be a team approach. You need to always be evaluating things that have happened, and again, include your near misses. And do we have the risk levels right? The risk levels that we're assigning may need to be continuously adjusted as conditions change. And again, more data becomes available. The more data you've got, the better your risk efforts will be. Now, where to assess risk? I can simplify this. Everywhere. Because once again, it is not possible to start measuring risks in isolation. Everything that you do in one process affects something else. Your new regulations, all of this has wide-reaching effects. So I would just prefer you to try and make risk something that your whole organization thinks of, discusses, and measures. It's the absolute best way. Now, of course, sometimes an organization isn't ready for that. So sometimes we have to start small, prove some success, and grow it. But that also means we might have to end up adjusting our terms and our risk measures as we increase the scope. Sometimes that's the only way to do it. Right? Some risk tools that you might consider. And again, some of these have over the years been slotted to specific industries, to specific uses. I'd really like you to rethink that. Try and get a high-level understanding of what each of these tools does, why it might be effective in certain situations. Is it useful? Great. If it's not, set it aside, but don't discard it. Be able to evaluate it and understand that in another context, it might be very useful. These range from the very simple to electronic libraries to some that many of us probably haven't heard of. So I'll discuss all of these. This is not all-inclusive. There are more ways to evaluate risks out there. Right? And again, you can't do this in isolation. It really needs a group effort. Simple one to get started with and very valuable is the idea of a decision tree. It's got tremendous value because it's very easy to integrate with everyday processes. It does not require a lot of effort, and it can get people thinking about the level of risk. You can then automate this further. Just to use standard terms, a decision tree is just a set of questions that we're going to guide someone through, and based on their answer, they now need to go to a next question, or they'll be given some guidance. So at the conclusion of the decision tree, there's an output. Yes, this is critical. No, it's not. Yes, you need a CAPA. No, you don't. There can be a number of different outcomes, but they're very easy to work with, can use them practically anywhere. They don't have to be high technology, although they certainly can be automated. And you just need to ensure that they're all inclusive and that the terminology allows someone to simply make their way through a path, and there's only one correct answer. Right? So decision trees, very easy to use. I've seen them in just about every industry. This is the most common when we start talking about risk, the risk matrix. It's quick, it's easy, it is colorful. It quantifies a risk level, and it can use your assumptions, which hopefully you're going back to your data, both real and misses, and continuously validating. Again, probability and severity are the most commonly used. Detectability is another very common one. And depending on your industry, you may even want a level of control. Sometimes things are just not within the operator's control, and we have to accept that. We still want to measure it, but it may not be something that that person can control. Right? Next one. Enough said on the matrix. We'll talk more about it in a moment. The color codes are very common as well. 3, the normal stoplight's pretty common. I've seen people introduce an orange. I've also seen people use a numeric value. Whatever works. I do like the idea of the color code and the graphics so people can visualize it. Right? And once again, we need common terminology. The next one is really the first place where you need to start thinking, could this work? Could this be used for me outside of its traditional context? Because HACCP, hazard analysis critical control point, is most widely used and most widely thought of in food. We take a look at our process, we define where the hazards are, we analyze them, and we decide whether that is a critical control point or not. And then we do something about those critical control points. great, but it's not limited to food. I could be doing a hazard analysis and a critical environmental point, a critical safety point. There is nothing saying that I am limited to a control point. It can cover a wide range of other areas, right? And in fact, a couple of the standards spell that out, but they're typically only looked at within their industry. So I strongly suggest that you could use hazard analysis just about anywhere. Next one is the idea of a risk survey. Oh, and before I leave that, I should have mentioned that you're seeing here your traditional green, yellow, red. We're tying back to the risk matrix. So the risk matrix can be used by many of these. And in fact, almost all of the ones that we're going to talk about next can incorporate that risk matrix. Next is the idea of a risk survey. This is the idea of looking for known risks, asking different areas of your organization to rank them, and giving them the opportunity to identify new risks. This is very often done under the guise of enterprise risk management. It's an annual sort of event. We go out, we survey managers, we ask them about the risks they're seeing, what's changed, re-rank these, do we need new actions, do we need new controls, are there new risks that we should be talking about and including in the survey? Maybe it only affects your group, maybe it's something nobody else has thought of yet. So the idea of surveying and looking for risks is powerful. And again, this is coming back to that idea that we need to involve a large sample group and go across your whole organization. What are the risks you're seeing? Could be done manually, but now we're starting to get into a fairly large amount of data. Right. Next one is one that is highly slotted and thought about in specific industry. And once again, I would argue that it should not be thought of strictly that way. Please evaluate the idea of an FMEA, a failure mode and effects analysis, and see how it will work with just about any process you do. They are usually thought of for design and production processes. But when we're designing something, when we are producing something, we are once again interacting with our environment, our workers. Again, you simply cannot isolate this. These have traditionally been thought of in the context of the automotive world. In fact, they came out of the Automotive Industry Action Group, AIAG. They still are really thought of just in manufacturing. And as you can see, it's primarily a sort of engineering type document. It's not nearly as graphical as the risk matrix, but we're doing the same things. We're looking for where things can go wrong. We are measuring the probability, the severity, and in the case of the AIAG standard, the detectability. So the same concepts are there. You can tie this back to a risk matrix. You can tie to the controls that you need to put in place. It works. It can be used with across a variety of topics. The process is really the same. We need to brainstorm them. We need to analyze them. We need to review them and address controls. This is a very generic way of looking at all of the risks. And once again, it's gotten pigeonholed for an industry. I would argue it should not be. The next one is fascinating to me. I'll just skip past the form. It is the idea of bow tie. Bow tie really came out for very low occurrence events, but if this event came true, then the effects could be catastrophic. They actually originated in oil and gas industry, but they have been heavily adopted by the airline industry, where I'm sure you'd agree we don't see a lot of events but when we do, they can be extremely serious. It gets its name from the shape. We have the undesired event or operational state, depending on whose terminology you're using, at the center of the bow tie. And fanning out on either side are a larger number of items. So when you see one at a high level, it truly has the shape of a bow tie. On the far left, we've got the threats that our organization faces. Then we've got preventive controls that we put in place to prevent that hazard from being released. On the other side are recovery controls. So in other words, in the middle, we've got a loss of control. On the left, we're trying to prevent a loss of control. If we do lose control, doesn't necessarily mean anything has gone bad. This is back to the near misses. A recovery control might have saved us and stopped us from reaching that consequence. So these are great. And they really have a lot of value because you can graphically illustrate all of the risks that you might be facing and actually trace a path of this threat got stopped by this control or got past this control, got on to a next level control. You can trace an event right through a matrix, through a model, I should have said, excuse me. Once again, some people would tie the risk matrix back to this. Others would argue it has no place, but I've seen both. These are really valuable, and we are starting to see some other industries with interest in them. So they have implications far beyond air, far beyond chemical, far beyond oil and gas. I've seen regulated companies interested in them. They have implications for your environmental. That's certainly an undesired event that can have huge consequences. So can an injury or worse to a worker. So the model works for a lot of risks. Very simple example, courtesy of Google or Wikipedia, and something that I'm sure we can all relate to, the idea of a car. We've got lots of threats. We've got our controls in place. We've got the undesired state of losing control. We've got recovery controls and the consequences. If you think of an easy example like this, it's very, very simple to start extending this model to your industry and to think, could this be a tool that we can use? It does not have to be catastrophic events. This can be used for a wide variety of purposes. Risk register. No matter how many different tools you were using, the idea of gathering all of the risks, no matter how they are being measured, as long as you're using the same terms, the same outcomes as much as possible, putting them all in one place, a risk register, is very helpful because now you can start to see all of the hazards that you've got, where risks are coming from, and start to look at trends. I mentioned the idea of trending for near misses. So a risk register or library, as a lot of people might think of it, gives you a one place to look at everything that is affecting your organization. All right. Next, we see risk register as the new center of your compliance efforts. And I realize this is very small type. All I'm attempting to say here is that risk sits at the center of virtually everything that you're going to be doing. And if you're logging, if you're cataloging, if you're categorizing, this risk register will capture everything from all of your inputs and give you a place where you can be querying. I mentioned that data is king. This is a perfect example, the risk register. So let's summarize. Risk technology is not automatic. It takes a lot of effort. Tools can support you, can help you with the decision-making process, but you need a group of experts to make the final decisions. You need a team. And again, that's got to be cross-functional. You need to increase visibility and education I'd say you need your whole organization to be thinking about risks. You need to vet your risk assessment methods using historical examples to ensure that you've got accurate results. In other words, go back, evaluate things that have happened in the past. We considered this to be really bad. Would it fit our model? Do we need to change any definitions? It offers a common language for all of your compliance efforts. It's applicable to, I would argue, not many operational states, to all of your operational areas. Your whole organization should be thinking about risks. It provides an objective way to prioritize adverse events that you might be seeing. There are many known risk models out there that can help you. And again, try not to just pigeonhole them. Please try and think of them as, could this tool work for me? Despite its name, despite its history, could it work for me? Risk terminology offers you a very common understanding and a way to understand complex operational issues even if you don't know the whole process. So it gives you a common language to talk to anyone about where things could be going wrong. It allows you to harmonize terms and bring it down to very simple color codes or levels of severity, something everyone can understand. And that's the key value of using risk across your whole organization. That actually concludes the slides that I had to share with you today.
Great.
At this point, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Glenn. That was a wonderful presentation. Before we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to remind everybody of the short evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. That should be appearing on your screen now, and let me push that out there. It should be popping up now. We're asking that you take the time to complete the survey to share us your thoughts. Your input helps us improve future webcasts. If you don't see the evaluation survey on your screen, please turn off your pop-up blocker. Okay, let's get to some questions here. You mentioned, Glenn, you mentioned several risk methodologies that are non-EHS. Could you tell me a little bit more about those and how exactly could they be applied to EHS?
Sure. And we're referring to several, I'm assuming the idea of the HACCP that we could extend, the idea of the FMEA, the bow tie. These are all things that have been pigeonholed, for lack of a better term. If you just Google or ask your favorite search tool on risk tools, I would not even confuse the idea of risk assessment versus risk management, risk tools or risk measures. You'll find a wealth of information. The list that I provided, and you've already mentioned that the slides would be available after, is not even an all-inclusive. There are more ways out there. Some will probably resonate more to your organization and what you do than others. They're certainly the place to start, but again, I would not ignore any of them. I would simply do a quick Google on risk tools.
Okay, great. On the slide of where to assess risk, you mentioned several areas outside of EHS. Are you suggesting that this community get involved in quality in the evaluation of their risks?
I am. I am suggesting that, and now sometimes in order to get our organization talking about risk and seeing some success, we have to start small. But I am suggesting that risk really is that umbrella. It affects our whole organization. Ultimately, you'd want everybody from every area speaking in one meeting about where risks are presented. And the risks are going to be affecting product, so quality's got a say, environmental, there's a say there, safety, there's certainly a huge say there, but they're all interrelated. There is simply, in my mind, no way to slice these and say this doesn't interact with anything else. So yes, ultimately that is what I'm saying, but again, to sometimes prove success and get some acceptance, we do have to start small.
Okay, fantastic. We had a question regarding the bow tie graph. Is there how should you approach it? Should you approach it, begin the bow tie from the hazard side, or should you approach it from the threat and consequence side?
I would actually start right in the center. I would start in the center of what is our undesired operational state, what is the event, what is it we're trying to prevent? Because really that's everything that we're putting in place on the left, as well as some recoveries. From that event, you can very easily define the far outside edges. So I'd start in the center, then I'd go to either outside edge, the threats themselves. What could lead to us losing control, having this event? And then what are the consequences? So once you've got the center, your starting point, and there's typically only one. And by the way, even a very large organization in an industry like air is probably only going to have about a dozen models. You do not need dozens and dozens of these. You don't need hundreds of them. There's going to be very few with those center points clearly defined and differentiated. So define the center, define the threats, define the consequences, start filling in where you've got controls and how they tie to a threat on either side of the bow tie, the preventive or the recovery, and then look for gaps. Look for places where you've got a vulnerability. You know, if I've only got one control against this threat, what happens if somebody doesn't do what the procedure tells them to do? Certainly can and does happen. So do I have other controls in place? That's the way to start building your model. And again, it needs to be a group think. Can't emphasize that enough. You need multiple perspectives. It becomes a brainstorming session, and when you're defining the center and far outsides, there are no bad ideas.
Okay. Going off that idea of getting more people involved, if you're just starting to educate your peers in risk management for EHS, is there a place where you would recommend individuals starting first? Should they start with audits or incident investigations or planning?
I would personally think that the incidents are the place to start. Personally, I think that an incident, depending on your definition, can include environmental, safety, or even both. Somebody tripped and spilled. Somebody was injured and spilled. There's an easy place to capture a wide variety of data. And once again, if you're doing it, near misses are incredibly valuable. So to me, that's the place to start. In the world of health and safety, the incident/near miss is the area to start on first, to start evaluating, to start building some common terminology, hopefully proving some success, and spreading this thinking to the rest of your organization.
Okay, great. We're looking for a little clarification here. There's been some phrases that you said. I was hoping you could help us explain the difference between risk assessment and risk management, and
Sure.
how those are two different things.
Certainly. The risk assessment is really the idea of just identifying and classifying the risk. So defining all the terms, are we going to call this low, high, medium? Are we having 3 levels, 4 levels? What are they? Let's go find them all. Management becomes, okay, great. We know what they are. What are we going to do about them? Can we accept it? Can we put controls in place? Do we need to push it off to a supplier? Do we need to insure against it? Is this just an activity that we cannot continue to do? And then you need to put your controls in place once you know what you want to do about that risk. And then you need to go back and monitor. And then as soon as you've got controls in place, you've altered your risk landscape, you're back to the top, and you need to remeasure and reevaluate. So assess is just identify and quantify. Manage is do something about them and then go back and remeasure again. That's a continuous process.
Okay. What about near misses? Do you know of any data supporting how near miss programs can result in fewer accidents or injuries? And how does that fit into what we're talking about today?
We do. And in fact, we've got customers that do this. Using our tools, they record incidents and near misses, and they monitor those, and they set a threshold. Using a specific report type, you would set a threshold. So, you know what, again, the more data, the better. We have one near miss. It may not really and truly mean too much. But if you start to see 2, if you start to see 3, especially within the same area and the same basic criteria, like a near miss with a forklift in a specific area of manufacturing, it's time to do something. We've been lucky. No one's been injured. We haven't damaged anything, but we're aware of threshold. I'll call it 3. We're aware of 3. We better see what's going on before this turns more serious. We've got customers who would immediately trigger an alert. Somebody would either go do a corrective preventive action or simply do an audit. We need to get into that area and find out what's going on. They can't be viewed as punitive. It's got to be, we're here to prevent this from getting worse. So yes, we've got customers that actually do this. And it allows you to start being predictive in risks and not waiting for something bad to happen. Incredible value.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, with near misses, for a company or workplace that's collected thousands of near misses, but they haven't quite found the best way to manage that, is there a particular model or dashboard tool you would recommend they use?
Well, of course, we'd recommend our software, but there are lots of ways that you can measure. All of the tools that I talked about, I mentioned it was not an all-inclusive list. I chose those because our tool actually has applications to manage each of those risk methodologies and build your risk register. No matter how you're measuring them, they're going to end up in one place. Doing this manually is tough. In fact, it's really tough because I've already said numerous times, the more data, the better. Very quickly, you're going to be beyond being able to manage this manually. There's just too much data there, too many variables. You need technology. And again, you've got to get the acceptance that this does not come cheap, but compliance doesn't. This is a way to be more compliant. It's all in how I say you would present the value of using risk measures.
Along those lines, we had a question here with how to appeal to the management or ownership about the virtues of compliance software versus doing it manually. How would you approach that situation?
Here's the way to get immediate attention from a manager of just about any level. I would say to virtually anyone in authority, are you absolutely sure you know the top, pick a number, 10 risks, 5 risks that you face and that they're under control? Because there's at least one risk out there that, to use a common term, keeps that person awake. There's something that is their overriding concern. But I'm willing to bet there are others that they don't recognize as potentially as nearly as severe, potentially worse. Because people are so bad at assessing risk, and it's just the way our brains work, having data, being able to quantify it is tremendous value. And if you can say, I've got a tool, I've got a methodology that can help summarize what the real risks that we're facing are, you've got attention, I promise. Okay,
fantastic. Wanted to ask a question going back to the bow tie a little bit. Would you say that risk that disrupts the core mission of the organization would be a great starting place?
It certainly is, because that is really your loss of control. That is really our, again, different industries use different terms, but that is our undesired operational state. That is our loss of control. That is the so yes, I would agree with that. That is a great that is a great place to start your bow tie. And once again, each organization would actually not have that many of them. I would, guideline, you're looking at 6 to probably 12 to 15 at the most for even an airline.
Okay. Where can people go to learn a little bit more about bow tie risks?
There is actually the best place is actually a vendor that provides bow tie software. We do not currently have an affiliation with them, although the tool is awesome. We are going to be integrating with it, but it is called Bow Tie XP. The letter X, the letter P is in Peter, and It is a European company, and they've got a nice little primer. And they publish some models, and they actually provide a tool that can help you build the bow tie model. So it's a great primer. In fact, I had better luck with that than I had with Wikipedia and Google, and that's highly unusual. So usually the Google and just a search is my starting point. But in this case, that tool, Bowtie XP, had a beautiful description, was non-technical, and provided some nice visual examples. If you're interested in bow tie, and I personally think it's a fantastic methodology, I'd suggest starting on that site.
Okay,
no plug. Great. We are not affiliated.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. We have time for just one more question, and this kind of touches on a little bit what you were saying earlier about, evaluating more, outside of just safety. How can an organization quantify and compare risk levels from different sources, environmental, production, safety, legal, finance, so forth? That
comes back, in my opinion, to that risk matrix. If you can come up with a matrix, and now sometimes your organization will need one, but I would push and fight and push back as hard as I could to try and come up with one risk matrix that meant the same across all parts of the organization. And sometimes it's possible, and sometimes it truly is not. But that is the place to start building. And I mentioned, no idea which slide at this point, but I mentioned at some point that if we have to start small, you build your risk matrix for you, but as you expand to others, you've got to recognize that some of our definitions may change and some of our terms may change. Really, that matrix is the one that will identify the risk terms to everyone across the organization.
Okay, great. Thank you, Glenn. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I apologize. There were certainly a lot of questions out there that we didn't get a chance to answer. However, don't worry. All of those questions that we didn't get an opportunity to address will be forwarded on to Glenn, who can respond. Once again, I want to take the time to thank you and ask you to fill out the evaluation survey. I'm pushing it out one more time just to make sure it pops up on your screen. Give us your feedback. We'd appreciate it. It can help further additional webcasts. And with that concludes today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Glenn, ETQ, and everyone who listened in. Thank you, and have a great and safe day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.